very general question. How much would you say is it valid to have one model for the Roman economy? How much do we need to think of local economies with different models which function in different ways?
Yeah.
So to put it in other words, what would be the geographic range you're talking, or you need to model? Is it just now you have the examples from the Eastern Roman Mediterranean world. Would that fit for the whole? On how do we scale that to fit models or to not fit models?
Yeah, that's a good question because you know I've been talking about two very different ways of modeling. One way is the very interesting but rather descriptive way of theory modeling, where you know certain empirical observations give rise to certain ideas that could explain those observations. They might not necessarily be testable or representable, but they don't have to be. And those models, like that by Bang and Temin, tend to be rather macro scale, very complex things because they're not meant to be explanatory on a small scale. The rather methodological hypothesis testing models that I've shown in practice here, they can only be useful when they when they're developed to address very specific research questions that often tend to be rather region specific or subdiscipline specific. So, I mean, it would be wrong to say that there's any methodological hypothesis testing without any of the theory modeling itself, right? So, to answer your question, the hypothesis testing kind of modeling can be used on any conceivable scale as long as it's useful to do so. But it is really more dependent on the theory model and the scale at which that works, which generates the hypotheses that require testing. In the case of the study of the Roman economy, a lot of these are on a large geographical scale. So that kind of validates approaches as I shown here, where I can work on a large geographical scale because, well, I think I've got arguments to do so, but other people can do it, so why can't I?
I have a couple of curiosities about your model. One thing I didn't understand is the nodes in your network are represented by the markets, not by the traders, right?
No. Sorry, I probably didn't explain that very well. So in the representation that I showed you of the actual model, you saw nodes and they were markets, but on those nodes are smaller nodes that are traders. So as far as a social network is concerned, the nodes are the traders, and the traders are connected to each other and the markets are not.
Okay.
But through the connections of the traders, the markets are integrated. So you could talk about the integration of markets as a proportion of the number of traders on each market that have links with other markets. But I chose to represent it as individual traders rather than markets.
And one curiosity historically. Is there enough evidence, or is there some evidence at least to try and build some kind of social network of traders in the Roman world, or markets in the Roman world? Or?
Yes, I think there is. I would love to do that, by the way. It obviously means getting your hands dirty with some actual archaeological and historical data. I mean, as you've shown, basically I use a very large database and only use a fraction of the information in there. I ignore all of that interesting complexity of every individual site because it's not statistically, it doesn't allow me to make these kind of statements if I use all that detail, right? So, yes, I can punch to a couple of examples of that. Quite interesting is Sean Graham's work on the traders active in the brick industry in the Tiber Valley, to which he basically, it's super creative. So he basically took these bricks, and the bricks you can perform as kind of a geochemical analysis to see which clay sources were used for the bricks, and maybe the places where they were produced also had kiln sites. If that's the case, you could, especially in the very well documented study area of the Tiber Valley, identify who owned that plot of land, maybe who owned the brick manufactory itself. Sometimes they also have, they mostly have stamps on them, which indicate which potter or well, brickmaker in this case made it. Using that kind of information, which I found quite creative, he created this social network of the people that were active in it. So that's an example of empirical evidence. A great example is Dressel 20 amphorae that were produced in the south of Spain to transport olive oil all over the Roman Empire, but most visibly to Rome, where you have Monte Testaccio as a visible kind of reminder of the scale of how much of this olive oil was actually consumed on a yearly basis there. Now, what's special about Dressel 20 is that it's got all of these, well, not only stamps, but also writings on the neck and on the shoulders of some of the people who were involved in different ways along the life cycle of this amphora, in filling it and transporting it, how much they charge for it. So I think those are two very good examples of how you can actually come up with social networks of the Romans through archaeological data, but they are very, very specific examples. The kind of questions you can answer with that, are dependent on the data sources. So for example, just to elaborate on that, that's not possible for Eastern Roman tablewares. There are basically not a lot, or there was no common practice of stamping with the potter's name on it in the Eastern sigillatas.
Maybe this kind of evidence on how some of the markets would work can help somehow develop your model into something that's closer to.
Sure. I mean, the kind of models that I try to implement are kind of like on a macro geographical scale, and their implications are for the entire Roman Empire. I test them with data from the Eastern Roman Mediterranean. I think they could be extrapolatable, but that's not what I show. That's not the kind of data that I do. So yes, you could do, but then it just it's just waiting out there to be disproven, which is useful.
If I understood it right, you do experiments with several sets of parameters, and then you compare the result of your experiment with reality. So, but wouldn't you then somehow, with your winning sets of parameters, wouldn't you then expect that you find a universal pattern that can explain everything that is being traded at that time? Not only, I mean, you take one example, but then did you actually apply the same thing to other goods?
Yeah. So if I'm allowed to generalize your question a little bit, maybe what makes this model work specifically well for the distribution of tableware as compared to amphorae, luxury goods? Can I extrapolate it to other products? Is that what kind of what you're asking?
Yes, so if I understood it right, then somehow you can say for a certain time you have this market structure, and for a certain other time you have a changing other structure, and that would apply then to nearly everything.
So first of all, I'm quite cautious to interpret the importance of those experiments for explaining the differences between the periods. The main thing that I focused on my conclusions was in certain conditions you see large differences between the distributions, in others you don't. And then to answer your question more usefully, this model has a couple of factors in it that are specific to the distribution of tableware. They include the fact that there are only 4 production centers, the way in which the hypothesis by Bang specifically refers to the existence of different social networks that allow for the flow or for different distribution patterns of tableware. Another thing that I struggled with a lot actually was that a lot of hypotheses surrounding distribution of tableware actually have links into the distribution of other goods, especially the distribution of, consumables that you can visualize by looking at the distribution of amphorae, right? Now, this is something that this model was not designed to test, and it's not a kind of interpretation I'm very comfortable with. So I try to keep it as specific as possible to this one product, and I don't think it can be extrapolate it to the other products. But I think to extrapolate it to, or to modify it to include the amphory would be an obvious next step. I am not confident about the luxury goods. I'm not very aware of the literature surrounding that.
You have as well this problem of the distribution connected to minerals.
Yes,
So
exactly.
yeah, that's a big problem for such a model. But
Yeah. Yes and no. Well, first of all, no, because, and this is an easy answer, because it was not designed to address that, right? But that is the easy way out. When I mentioned at the start that there's, we've got this problem of the differences between the wideness of distribution in the tableware, one of the way archaeologists have tried to explain that, one of the important factors is maybe those production centers were close to the extraction areas of minerals or of other goods, for example. It's not something that this model can really test, but it could be expanded on. My interpretation of the results of the experiments in which I have different numbers of traders at each production center, right? I interpreted that as maybe it's interesting to look at the role of active urban hubs very close to the production centers themselves. This could be easily interpreted as other reasons for trading this pottery more frequently because there were other minerals. Now, I just pushed the interpretation in that direction, but there's nothing to say that it wasn't anything else.
If I may, I see a main problem because I think it implies a primitivist your traders-based ABM.
No, I actually don't think so. I mean, I think the bang hypothesis is very strongly in that direction. I think the Temin hypothesis is almost as strongly in the modernist direction. I think my implementation is extremely neoclassical as far as economical paradigms are concerned, which is kind of not very sexy at the moment, actually, in the study of the Roman economy, where they're all talking about institutions and stuff, right? But if I can be blunt, I don't really care too much about this, right? Because what I'm trying to show is a framework that can be used also when you believe in other economic paradigms. But I disagree with, I mean, yes, to one extent it is primitivist, to the other extent it is modernist. I try to explore what happens in between.
Yeah, but the concept of the social network in this way could push the model into a primitivist interpretation. I mean,
definitely,
like, because you consider traders as agents, and it is as well like a free market economy. And you don't consider the Annona system and fiscus and
exactly
this kind of problem.
You're absolutely right.
I mean, it is very complex.
Exactly. And no one would disagree with you that it was very complex and that all these factors played some role or other. I focused on the social network thing, which might give you the implication that it is necessarily primitivist. And I wouldn't agree with that if the structure of the social network as a concept can change and drag it out, away from that concept of the primitivist. But the other things you mentioned are super important. The Annona, the state involvement. I showed that a certain degree of market integration was important, right? The obvious next question is, what are the factors that influence that market integration? What kind of institutions or maybe individual commercial actors had the possibility to give rise to that kind of integration? The state is obviously one of them, but how did their regulatory rules actually affect the distribution of these things? Those are extensions to this model, or they're completely different models, right? So I totally don't. I totally agree with you that it's much more complex than I represented here. But I think these kind of questions. These kind of questions, need to be addressed in the future by, I think, this kind of approach. But focused on different challenges. And the Annona is an obvious one. I mean, especially if we're thinking of expanding it with the addressal 20,
Mhm.
you know, with the hypotheses concerning the military Annona and stuff. I think, yeah, but I don't want to get my hands dirty in that direction just yet because it's a lot of literature.
No, I think this transport cost model could be more convenient for this question because you
Yes.
can consider like settlement hierarchy and geography. And
Yeah.
they are more maybe better manageable parameters than traders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say
I don't know,
I would say there are other parameters, not necessarily better ones. Maybe they are better for addressing different kind of questions.
Yeah.
And I steered away from the transport side of things because there are already quite a few models that aim to explore that in quite a lot of detail. So I chose to just go for the social networks because it was something new and also because I like it, let's be honest.
Yeah.
But you know, I don't have any illusions about how this can be applied to also explore these kind of transport and Annona related questions. I think that's different. Those are different models.